Okay, we'll get started. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Rachel Niener, who is director of the Gameful Learning Center here on campus, and works with obviously Academic Innovation Center. And Rachel has an interesting background. She has a doctorate in chemistry, and I just learned that with all her pedagogical interests, she followed that route so that she could become a teacher, and has been involved in a variety of faculty development positions centered around improving teaching on campus, and worked here for the Center on Research and Learning and Teaching, and now has a central role in academic innovation. So Rachel's going to give us an overview of her work and what she does within academic innovation, and then we're going to turn to our colleague Pete, who will talk to us and give us illustrations of his work with GameCraft.
Thanks, Tom. So, how many of you have heard of the Office of Academic Innovation? Okay, about half. So, a little bit about our office in the Gameful Learning Lab. The Office of Academic Innovation is actually a pretty new office. We're only about 2.5 to 3 years old. We used to be called the Office of Digital Education and Innovation, and we recently rebranded. When you've got two key initiatives on campus with the acronym DE&I, one of them is bound to change. And so we graciously stepped aside. The renaming was also about our broader focus than just digital education. When people hear that, they think creating videos, flipping the classroom, and we are definitely doing some of that, but we're also doing other things, including learning analytics and looking at large data sets to understand learning on campus, and curricular innovations. And one of those curricular innovations is Gameful Learning. So the Gameful Learning Lab is the newest of the 3 labs in the office. We officially launched September 1, so we're really quite new. But it's really the university's effort to institutionalize work that's been going on campus for the last 4 to 5 years. So a little bit of history of Gameful Learning. It comes out of a course that Barry Fishman was teaching. He's faculty, at the time he was in School of Education, he's transitioned over to School of Information. He was teaching a course called Video Games and Learning, which talks about the fact that video games in general, but video games in particular, are really good learning environments. And I want to just take a minute to talk about what we mean by video games as good learning environments. One of the key tenets is that people engage in gaming because it's hard, not despite the fact that it's hard. And we like to talk about the fact that so rarely do our students come to us and say, give me something harder to do. This was too easy. But what we really want is for learners to engage in the hard work of learning. And after, Tom talked a little bit about my history, after spending the last, longer than I'd like to admit, amount of time really thinking about how it is that people learn, one of the fundamental principles is it's hard. Learning is hard, just like all of you have experienced teaching is hard. And one of the reasons teaching is hard is because that act of learning really takes hard work. And so how do we get learners to really engage in that hard work, persist in it, and ideally enjoy it, but that enjoyment is actually a secondary concern for the Gameful Learning Lab. When people ask us, so is Gameful about making learning fun? We're like, no, actually, learning may be fun, may not be fun. We're really about that engagement, and that hopefully people are engaging in productive ways. So the premise of the Gameful Learning Lab is thinking about what can we do to create intrinsic motivation in our learners? How do we get them to engage in learning on their own volition, as opposed to because we tell them that they have to, or because they are going to get a grade at the end. And the way we do that is we talk about self-determination theory. And self-determination theory came out of University of Rochester, 2 scholars, Ryan and DC. They're both psychologists. And it's been put into play in the education sphere as well as in public health and looking at behavior change more generally. And the tenets of this are that people will engage in an activity if they feel like they have choice over it, if they feel like they belong to a community or aren't just a number participating in this event, and if they feel like they can succeed at it, if they've got a sense of competence. And so video games really are built on those three principles. When you think about games, there are usually multiple pathways to success. So there's choice in how to go about engaging with that activity. Almost all games build up from zero. Never when you start a game are you told you've got 100%, and now it's your chance to maintain that 100%, otherwise you lose, which is how we actually set up our classrooms. And so games build up from zero, and you only see progress toward your goal as opposed to deficiencies. And when you do make mistakes, you get instant feedback about that. So we have thought about how can we construct classrooms to model these elements. And one of the ways we've done that is by building a tool called Gradecraft that Pete will talk a little bit more about. But this tool is designed to make it easier for instructors to teach using these principles. The future of the Gameful Learning Lab, I want to talk just a little bit about where we're headed. So we've built Gradecraft, and hopefully that will actually be in use amongst a wider range of instructors in the near future. It'll be commercialized and available for non-U of M people to purchase in the near future. It will always be free to U of M. But in addition to that, we want to think about other elements of formal learning environments and how we might redesign them. So some of the pressing questions of the lab are, how can we make group work actually work? So thinking about that belongingness component, we know that groups are great environments for people to learn, but most students dislike it for an array of reasons. And students' dislike of group work often disincentivizes instructors from taking the time to really create good group activities. So we're thinking about how we might be able to design technologies or curricular innovations to support better group work. We're also looking at the elements of simulations and how can we make it easier for higher ed instructors in particular to create engaging, non-cheesy simulations for college and graduate student learners to really build some of those soft skills that we talk about and want students to come out of higher education with. And so those are two of the questions that we have and that we're looking at how to address. But really the flagship project of the Gameful Learning Lab is Gradecraft. So I'm super excited to hand things over to Pete. He is one of our more prolific users of Gradecraft. I think he's used it for 4 terms for MBS 241, as well as for anatomy and physiology. And I'll let him share his experience. And I'll be around for the entire session if you've got questions about the lab, the tool, or academic innovation in general. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Rachel. So thank you all for coming. So Melissa was maybe first asked me, 18 months, 2 years ago or so, Pete, when are you going to talk about Gradecraft? I was like, I'm not talking about Gradecraft in front of my colleagues at this point. And so probably if it's not, it'll become clear why I was nervous about it. But as Rachel has described, I've been doing this for a while. So if you have major issues with my use of Gradecraft and this kind of a strategy, then it's probably time that you let me know about it. So in this case, I want to share with you, Rachel mentioned that it's been many semesters I've used it now for MoveSci 241. And I used it actually one time for our anatomy phys course last winter. And so I'll talk about both of those because it's really different situation. And I kind of took on the challenge in this case of using it in the anatomy phys course, and it was interesting. So I'll share those things with you. So one piece that I think is important to recognize is the size of this class, and that's part of what the marketing was in this case. If you have more than 200 students, then what do you do about that? So that alone is kind of a big deal. So right now we're at about a 250 student cap. Not that there aren't more students interested, but that the room that I have really won't allow more. So I started using it, I believe, in winter. 2015 is the first time I used it. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I think this is my 5th time using it for move side 241. And so you can see that typically I'm around 250 students after those first couple semesters. And so it's a big class, and from that standpoint, it's tuition, it's revenue, etc. And so those things are, of course, important for some. But what I wanted to think about is, what am I trying to accomplish here? And so Vic handed this course off to me and provided me at the time a syllabus, I think was what he provided me, which is better than nothing, but of course publicly available. So it was, I wasn't sure how to take that, whether that was like, whatever, start from scratch. But I did have some details from students that had him, and so I kind of knew the way the class ran. So my first time doing it, I followed, I think, generally kind of what he had done. And then I decided to try this gradecraft and this sort of gameful approach. So also related to the students that are in my course, it's useful to kind of get a picture of where they are from. So in this case, primarily about 60% of them are from LS&A. This is just over the last 2 semesters, but you can see it's pretty consistent. Though I typically tell students in movement science not to take this course just because it has considerable redundancy to other courses that we're teaching, not to any particular course, but to a series of courses. The folks, I think, in 555 are kind of like, hey, this will be a good course because you're looking for a course that's not going to be as hard as your chemistry and other courses you're taking. And so because of that redundancy, it certainly, I expect, is not a very difficult course for them. So anyways, we have about 18% in this case, and we can always change that if we just make policy that a move-size student can't take it, then it's a done deal. I don't have any problem with that. But in this case, you can certainly talk to those students to see whether they think there's value. So there was 2 questions that I was commonly asked when I talked about teaching this class of 200 plus. So if outside of kinesiology, then the question is, Pete, how many GSIs support this class? And I'm always like, 0 GSIs. And they're like, huh? And so it's kind of funny. So I went to the Canvas thing this summer in Colorado, which was pretty cool, to learn kind of more about the nuts and bolts of Canvas, and then to also be with some people that are instructing crazy courses. So I learned that Stats 250 is 2,000 students. And so I was really interested, like, so how many GSIs do you have for that class? And so it's like 40 GSIs that they have for that class. So anyways, so that kind of puts some perspective for me. Okay, my class is not that big. It's only 250 students. So anyways, that was certainly one piece. And I think I finished with some comments related to this because lately we've been talking a lot about, hey, why don't we have more GSI positions? So I think this is a spot where we could, and there's been some discussion about that. And then another one that actually I'll throw Charlene into this. Charlene said, of course, you teach this class of 250 kids, but it isn't that bad because you just provide 1 midterm and 1 final and they're both Scantron. And I was like, and she's like, right? And I was like, yeah, I'm not ready to tell people about gradecraft because it was kind of like I couldn't be further from the truth for that to be what my class is because, as Rachel has described, part of the issue here is that they have choice. And so that means, in this case, many different ways for them to accumulate points. So it's definitely not 2 exams, Scantron, and we're done. Although I do have a midterm that is a multiple choice exam and a final that is a multiple choice exam, but that is not the sort of main basis of the course. So as I first heard about this, I'll be quick to admit, and my daughters, I think a couple of my daughters, these were sometimes later in the day, and so one of them I know attended like one of my first ones, and so she's like, oh yeah, Dad, I know about Gamified, and so she's kind of like, oh, I was there at the very beginning when you first started thinking about this. So it's kind of fun, but I was kind of like, this is pretty hippie, like they just have choice, they get to choose, like what's going on? And so when I was deciding to do this, I was like, I'm not a hippie. And then I was like, but what am I going to do? Because I really want students to appreciate here that this is a very different class. And so I decided to go, as they often say these days, all in. And I just said, okay, everything is optional. You have to make the choices of how you're going to accumulate these points. As Rachel described, this class starts at 0, and you got to work your way up to the grade that you hope to earn. And you have many ways to do that, and there isn't any one thing that I'm saying you have to do this, which of course, really, for many students, really blows their mind because they're like, wait, there's no final exam that I have to get, X, Y, or Z on. So anyways, in this case, I really liked that idea, so I just went full in. I kind of jumped in with both feet and said, all right, everything is optional. And then, of course, what I really like about it, and some students catch on quickly and some students take some time, is that they have the opportunity in this case to proactively jump in and, as Rachel was describing, sort of make choices and get invested and engaged. What do I want to do? How am I going to earn this grade that I want? What are going to be the steps that I take? What are going to be the assignments that I do? And so I really like that concept a lot because you all appreciate that there are some students that are like, I've heard this out of a student's mouth, what's the least amount I need to do to get an A? Right? That's often what students will say, right? And that I also had a student who once said, I figured out, usually on the first day, I'm trying to figure out, what's the least amount I need to do to get an A? And so I really don't like that piece at all. And in this case, that still could be their attitude, but it's at least starting from a different position. You're saying, okay, right now you don't have anything. What are going to be the steps you take? What assignments are you going to do in order to earn this grade? So this is direct from my syllabus, and this is the point scale. So it's kind of a gamified point scale where the values are really big. And so in this case, I mentioned having a midterm and a final. So the midterm and the final are worth 3,000 points each. If you had 100% on both, you would score 6,000 points. So there you are, 6,000 points, you have an F. Okay, so it's definitely different than, hey, there's 2 exams, and so there are 2 exams, but you can take them both, do nothing else, and you get an F. Okay, so it's very different from that standpoint. And part of my rationale to come back to here is that students from across this broad spectrum, some of them are going to take to my material very easily. The movement science students, they could, if it was just showing up for the midterm and the final, then it's really a joke of a class, because if they have redundancy with other classes, then what's the point at all? And then I would definitely have made a policy they shouldn't take it. But in fact, that only gets them so far. And then they have to choose, what are going to be the other ways that I score points? And the other piece that I commonly hear is from the students that are from the non-science majors or the social science majors, and I teach many cases in chemistry, and they're like, is there a lot of chemistry in this class? Because I really don't like chemistry. So on day one, they're ready to bail because they're worried that there's a lot of chemistry. And I think had this remained as sort of a traditional course, that there would be more students that would bail. And the primary reason is because they're nervous they can't have a good grade because they don't have the chemistry. And my feeling is, related to this course, that would be unfortunate. That in this case, I want students to learn wherever they are and from their own perspective. So it's definitely hippie for me to have that attitude, but I've kind of embraced it in particular for this course. Okay, so anyways, of course, as you can imagine, students begin to say, okay, 21,000 points is what I need. I think if you told all the possible points up, it's somewhere on the order of 34,000 points. I do have students that are like, what about an A+? And it's in this class that I learned that an A+ is not the same across campus. Does anybody know where an A+ is worth more than it is here in kinesiology? An A+ here is worth what? 4, just like an A, right? So what's the benefit of an A+? Except pride, right? Which is actually a good thing, and I like it when students are like, yeah, I get an A+, and I'm proud. Okay, but in business school, it's actually worth 4.4, which I didn't know. And actually, I learned through Great Craft because one of the other instructors is like, I don't give any A+. Because he's basically like, screw the business school. I'm not playing their game. I'm not going to have these business school kids come in and do this to get their 4.4. I'm not going to allow it. I decided to go a different route, and I said, I'm just going to make it really hard to do that. And then if they want to do that, then great. So what I said is, in order to get an A+, you have to be in the top point earners. So it's not like, hey, I have 21,000. Now it's like, whatever the other students do, you got to be towards the top of that. And you have to have 2 other things. You have to have an 80% or better on both exams. And you have to earn a badge. So in this case, there are different ways that you can get a badge in Great Craft. And they don't really control that. It's based on our opinion about their work. If they really do great work, then we might give them a badge. So there's no kind of like guaranteed, I'm going to get a badge because I work hard. It's kind of dependent on the graders. So anyway, so that's kind of the route I've taken. And I said there wouldn't be more than 5% of my class getting an A+, because I think that's a general rule of thumb that there shouldn't be more than 5%. So that's what I've done. The truth is that I actually probably don't even have 5% that have all of these qualifications. So Okay, so a couple other issues I want to share. One I've already mentioned, and that is that the students coming from the social sciences tend to be very concerned. So my first time around, their experience here is like, oh my gosh, like I can't prepare for these exams. It's so much work because there's so many things that I had never heard about. And so I decided that that was not something that made a lot of sense to me, that there was a lot of benefit they could have from this course, and that their stress over sort of going back to learn things that I thought were important related to the chemistry and the physiology didn't seem like it was really worthwhile. And yet I didn't want to make it have no chemistry, because then it's like, it's not that useful for people that have that background. They're like, well, this course is so cheesy. You know, we're not even going to try to incorporate the chemistry of exercise and nutrition. So what I like a lot about this setup is on day one, okay, before the students are in their current status, right, where they're all freaking out because it's the end of the term and they don't want to hear about any, you know, like opportunities. You know, on day one, they're actually like, whoa, we're here and it's a new semester, and they're kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, hopefully. And so in this case, I really challenge them and I say, okay, like, don't be a loser. Don't be like, what's the least amount I could do to get an A? Like, decide what are going to be the things you want to do. What do you want to make of this? You're paying tuition. Somebody's paying tuition. Somebody's paying tuition, and you want to get something from this course. So there are lots of different possibilities. So this is small, and I kind of come back to revisit these. So I mentioned 34,000 points, and I didn't do the math, but I think these add up to that. So I've mentioned already that there are 2 exams, 3,000 points each. And in this case, I also have 3,000 possible points from participation. I break that up into 4 different kind of subsections across the term, and I use the active learning platform for this. And I'll just have an example of that in a moment. I also have 3 assignments and then some challenges. Again, all of these are options for them. Nothing here is you have to do any of these. They have to accumulate points. So online quizzes are effectively auto-graded quizzes, which of course is important given the other grading that I have going on here. So those are auto-graded, or at least 90% auto-graded. There might be like a final question that needs to be graded for each student. And then lecture quizzes, which are based off of the lectures, so it's really kind of preparation for the exams. And there are 7 of those at 500 points each. And then writing assignments. We have 3 case studies, 1 over obesity, 1 over disordered eating, 1 over muscle hypertrophy, as well as a possibility for a literature review. You can imagine my excitement for them to choose that one, especially with 200 possible people, or 250. So, but I put it towards the end of the term, and so I have a strategy there to make sure that there aren't 250 literature reviews to read. So just to give you a little more flavor of the different ways that they can accumulate points, these online quizzes that I mentioned that are auto-graded, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of these. And so what I've done in this case is work with the library to have them stream these documentaries from Canvas. So they work with me. It's a pretty easy process. And so I don't know how many of you are familiar. I presume all of you are familiar with at least 1 or more of these documentaries. And so you sort of have some flavor of what they're about. Fed Up is maybe one that's not as commonly known. This one is much more about what are the causes of obesity. I suppose they all relate to that. Cowspiracy is much more of a vegan lifestyle kind of a movie. And so in this case, it's optional for them to accumulate points this way, but I do dedicate a period for us to have discussion about this. So whether they actually watch that or not, they will be hearing the discussion of others that have watched these videos. And then similarly, I have 3 New York Times articles that I traditionally have used that relate to things we're talking about in class. Genetically modified organisms, as an example. One that's about supplements and the use of supplements and how hospitals are handling supplements and how poorly this is regulated, et cetera, et cetera. And then one that's about the issue of obesity and weight loss. And the New York Times actually has had a couple great articles that describe people that have lost weight and the sort of struggles that they have to maintain that weight loss, and how there seems to be a considerable kind of reprogramming that makes weight regain a very great likelihood. And so we talk some about that, and these articles certainly support that kind of a concept. So I didn't get into the details of the assignments, and so I just want to talk about those for a minute. So this is consistent, I believe, with what Vic did, at least the first two. A dietary diary, so a 3-day diary, so all of you probably did this at some point in your life. In this case, also a 3-day physical activity diary. For many students, this is new for them because they're coming from lots of different areas, and so this is not something they've done, and they're kind of like, oh my gosh, how do I put it all together? So ultimately it leads to them getting a summary of their energy intake, how many calories per day, what is the net macronutrient composition, how many carbs, how much fat, how much protein is in your diet, and then some reflections on that and some application type questions. How do your values compare to the RDA, things of that sort. Physical activity diary we also do, and so they're recording for 3 24-hour periods what they are doing, and then coming up with some values related to energy expenditure. And then again, points for kind of reflection and application. So what if you increased your physical activity by, doing X, Y, or Z? So trying to get them to kind of embrace these pieces, energy intake, energy expenditure. I also have them an option for them to do an energy balance assignment. So there's actually a speaker here. I can think of his first name and not his last. I don't know if Greg, you remember the guy who came from NIH. Who talked
Kevin Hall?
Yeah, Hall. Kevin Hall came and gave a talk here. So he has looked at and kind of has mathematical calculations from randomized controlled trials of people trying to lose weight. And what is the actual mathematics? So the common thing for 30 years ago or 40 years ago is 3,500 kcals equals 1 pound of fat. And so as if magically, if we begin to restrict, that all of it is going to be fat, right? Which is not really logical. We don't expect that. There's so much data to support or not support that. And so this actually is something that he has provided on the web. And so I provide them kind of an assignment that relates to that so that they can kind of go in and tinker around with their energy intake, their energy expenditure, and what you would expect to be the actual weight loss if you changed your diet or changed your physical activity level, rather than the old school kind of 3,500 kcals equals 1 pound of fat, and therefore we know what we'll lose, because that doesn't seem to hold up so well. Then we also have these challenges, and most students will do these, so it's worth a total of 2,000 points, and it's an 8 or 9 week challenge. We're at the end of it now. So I pulled out of this, from the assignment, actually, something that we wrote about the dietary challenge. Use this assignment as an opportunity to challenge yourself to discover new things and to practice persistency, to learn how to make a change in your eating behaviors or how to explore new territory regarding you and food. You may be surprised at what you discover. Your grade does not depend on how successful you are, but rather on what you learn about challenging yourself. And so very hippie-ish in this case, I'll say, they're getting points for their reflections written each day. So they're choosing some challenge, which we then approve or don't approve if there's some reason for us not to approve it, if it seems unhealthy, for example. And then they are writing reflections about that over that 9-week period. And really the same thing, I won't read this to you, but really the same thing here for the physical activity challenge. We're asking them to take on some new, hopefully healthful behaviors regarding physical activity. So the lit review, I'm in the middle of right now, so I don't really want to talk about it, but you know what a lit review is, and I can tell you that students coming from this wide of a thing have no idea what a lit review is. If they're coming, I don't know what, I haven't gone back to see where these people are coming from, but I have so much detail about this needs to be original scientific literature, and they're like, Muscle Mag says this, and I'm like, okay, good job. So let's reflect on what original scientific literature is. So it's definitely some headaches. And so I try to make sure that this is really only taken by students that really want to do this and have some clue what they're doing. So participation, I do use the active learning platform, and I think many of you have seen that. It's great in a class this big, and I actually, I would say I enjoy using it in a class this big because, especially in this class, I tend to ask many opinion type questions. That I think help to keep them engaged. So I might say, for example, so do you think it's, well, some of them get into a little detail that can be kind of dicey. So do you think it's bad to eat meat, as an example? Like for people to kind of get an appreciation for their peers in a very non-confrontative way, because they can just kind of type it in on their thing in this case and get a sense. So the points here are not huge. the students definitely are trying to figure out that cohort still exists, what's the least amount I can do and still get an A. And so I hear them talking outside of my office why they need to sit there to talk about this. But they'll say like, yeah, I was at home and I was answering the active learning platform. John's, I'm sure, dealt with this, like they think they're like incredibly clever, like, hey, I could answer those questions from home. So it's kind of funny sometimes what they do. But this provides an example. Actually, this is from today's class. I taught from 1 to 2:30 today. What do you think is the #1 reason that Americans want to lose weight? And so I really love to see these because I have my own opinion about why Americans want to lose weight. But it's really interesting to get feedback, in this case, from 180 people in a very short time. In this case, 140 of them say aesthetics, which is what I figured as well. It's what I figured they would say. Our discussion today was all about weight loss and the health, implications of weight loss and the health implications of exercise without weight loss. But yet this is kind of what we're up against is people say, exercise, it didn't help me lose weight. It didn't work. I'm done. Like, I don't care about exercise anymore, which is my great frustration in this case. But it's reality, right? And so in this case, I can kind of get their honest opinion about things and we all can appreciate, hopefully, where each other are coming from. So part of the reason that, first I'll say this is not my grade distribution. I think that this is a concern for many, and so this is my true grade distribution from last winter, is I had 240, I guess, grades or so that I gave out, and 187 of those were in A. And so, this is part of the reason that when I first started doing this, I was like, I don't know that I'm ready to talk to my peers about this, And yet, there are certainly situations where we have a high number of A's. And so it's kind of a question of what's the right, does it need to be a normal distribution? This actually I pulled out because this is what my course looks right now. This is my course as of this weekend. I have 15 kids that are actually at an A. And today I had somebody come up after class. So once I get to the 21,000, do I have to come for the final exam? And I'm like, these kids are not too bright. Like, I was like, were you here on day one? I was like, I think so. But, they're just nervous because it's so non-traditional. They just get really nervous. And so he's like, what would be the advantage? And I was like, you might learn something. He's like, I mean, besides that. So anyways, it's kind of funny because you can have this conversation of why do you take classes, But of course, everybody is in this. I take it because I want to get an A. I need to get an A. I got to have a 4.0. So, yeah, Tom.
Just a quick question on the sequencing as I go through the class.
Yeah.
And you might see this trend that these kids who are below 10,100 points, is there any interaction with those kids about
reach out. I typically reach out when I see the kids at the bottom and I basically decide what's the cut point that I'm going to reach out to. And I say, I just want to make sure you understand how this class works. And I really do. I say that email and I have students that will respond and be like, thanks for sending that. I was like, okay. So anyways, so yes, that is an actual thing. Stop.
Have you figured out exactly which week most points are earned? So I'm guessing that the earning of points is mostly towards the end of the semester when they see this and they say, oh no, I gotta go do this.
Yeah, I haven't done that. I'm just too busy to step back.
We have that data actually that we're pulling for all the courses and are going to send to the instructors. It really depends on the course design. So some instructors front load their courses with a whole bunch of points at the beginning to make sure that students don't procrastinate too much and get the fact that they've got to do something different. I would say regardless, for most courses there is a chunk of students who earn a good portion of their points at the end of the term. Those aren't usually the students who are falling in that A category though. We see that the students who are earning A's are building up their score a little bit at a time in almost all the different course designs that we see.
So in terms of opportunities, are there cutoff dates for opportunities or things open for long periods of time?
So to follow up on Rachel, so I have opportunities that are open at the beginning and that have definitely closed. So like the diary piece, that's the first one and it's closed maybe at the end of September. So there are cut points along the way. And once that passed, then they're like, can I do that? I'm like, nope. I said, but there's lots of other ways, other things you can do. So that's the nice thing about this class is you don't have to be like, the dog ate my homework. You're like, oh, okay, well, you'll have to find some new thing to do.
It doesn't sound very hippie-ish.
It doesn't sound hippie-ish? That's true. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I mean, at heart, I'm not a hippie, so. Okay. So this is what it actually looked like last winter, and I suspect that this semester will look similar. There are people that will come that have already withdrawn from my class. You know, so there are people that have just missed the boat because nobody's saying, here's the deadline, you have to do this. What are you doing? And then they start to do the math finally in October, you know, the end of October, and they're like, whoa, I can't even pass this class because too many of those things have closed. So I have already had people withdraw. Right? You know, 250 kids, it's not that surprising, right, that some are going to withdraw. So also another piece that I don't ever know is some of these students will take it pass-fail. And so, because I'm like, what's wrong with these people? You know, like, what are they doing? But they're just kind of like, hey, I'm going to have a C, I'm good. You know, because they're basically, it's for them, a C is passing, and a B is passing, and an A is passing, and it's going to be the same grade for them. So I don't actually know how many of those students I have. Any other questions? So my distribution, there it is. Okay, so now you might say, okay, for this elective, we are okay with this. Hippie, maybe you're okay with it, maybe you're not, you'll let me know. But I decided to really kind of challenge myself, and I said, okay, but what about a course that is considered a gatekeeper course? Okay, and so don't worry, I didn't go too crazy here. People fail my class, don't worry. So in this case, anatomy and phys. So this is typically about 40 to 50 students. It is offered every winter. It is required of health, fitness, and athletic training students. In the case of health fitness students, they have to have a C or better to move forward. And so as we talk as health fitness faculty, we sort of say, okay, you know, these gatekeeper courses, this one being one of them, is important to kind of make sure that we don't have students just thinking like, oh, I'm just kind of floating around here in health fitness. So that's an important piece. And so I was kind of like, well, certainly I shouldn't use it in this. But then I began to think more about it, and I was like, I kind of want to use it in this. So I probably shouldn't, but I think it worked out. So, gamified gatekeeper. So it might sound like a bad idea, but I really like, now that teaching is my primary responsibility, it's fun for me to have this really diverse portfolio of courses, as well as these course structures. So here's what I did. I basically said, what really matters for this gate is this gatekeeping mechanism, is that they can do these in-class assessments. That's really what we care about, is that they can demonstrate that they can sit down and take this exam and do well on it. And so I basically designed the whole Gradecraft point system that they needed to be able to do well on those two things. And then what I did is it's almost like a backwards class. It kind of seems like there's choice, but in some ways it's kind of backwards. So what I did really is kind of, I don't know, maybe definitely not hippie-ish. So what I did is I basically said, this is kind of the structure of my class previously, that there were lots of points that came from the exams. So there are 2 exams here, 160, and then 60 more from in-class quizzes. So in this case, 220 of the 360 points came from those exams and those in-class assessments. And that's pretty much the way my class was before. So the choice that I opened up was whether they wanted to have all these other opportunities for points. Did they want to have participation be important towards this? Did they want to do worksheets to demonstrate their knowledge? Did they want to be able to have points? And effectively what we're talking about is, do they want to have this kind of more fluffy stuff in order to harshen the blow of these in-class assessments, right? If they're not as competent on these in-class assessments, then these things are helpful. And most of us have such things, right? So in this case, what I really opened up was opportunity for people to just say, hey, I don't need any of that stuff. Just give me these quizzes, these exams, cut out all the BS. I'm ready to demonstrate my competence. Okay? And so Rachel and others, I kind of like Pete, these words are not things that people are going to choose. But I was nervous about doing this, and so I actually called this the high-risk group. So you can imagine they're like, this is not inviting. So, you know, but in this case, I didn't want there to be confusion, and I didn't want some, forgive me, but some sort of unprepared student to say like, hey, this one looks really great because I don't have any of those things. I don't have to worry about that. I wanted it to be very clear that this was a high-risk option. So anyways, so how many students do you think, what percentage of my students chose high risk? 0? I had 1 out of 50 that chose it. I had 1 other who was retaking the class and who had a schedule that basically prevented him from being in my class. And so he chose this as well, because he's like, yeah, I could do it. So anyways, and then I had 1 other person choose the medium risk. So it was very interesting to me how few people did it. In my experience, if somebody's had AP Bio, which includes some physiology, then I think as a freshman they can come in and they could easily do this. Or they could do it. It might not be easy, but they could definitely do it. But most of the kids, which was good for me because I just was nervous about people misinterpreting the setup here and really not, they shouldn't be choosing one of these, but they were. So in this case, I was a little bit relieved that they actually chose the low risk. All right, so anyways, my philosophy in this case, though, is that I'm still doing what I need to for the gatekeeper course. I'm still making sure they have competence in those exams. I'm still making that a very important part of their passing this class. But for 241, I don't think it's about their competence on some exam. I mean, that tends to be the way that we are generally, like, hey, what's your competence on this exam? But generally speaking, for a class like this, which is open across campus and people come in with really different backgrounds, I just don't see it as the most important thing. The bigger thing for me is that students are taking away something valuable. And I think that this course allows that to happen. So choice is something important in the case of this 241 class. Eliminating this for some people would be eliminating busy work, which they see as very valuable. And I'm like, have at it. It's less that I need to grade, right? And I don't need to worry about your participation. I don't need to worry about those things. So great, go for it. So anyways, to wrap up here, so choice, of course, is one of the things that Rachel mentioned. Challenges, I think, is part of what I like about these courses, is trying to challenge the students. And then how important competence is. And I've already mentioned that not every course, in my opinion, needs to be competence-based. Certainly if we're talking about some class that's the precursor to the next class, then that's really important. But in the case of this elective, I think it's less important. So, does every class have to have a normal distribution? You'll obviously have issues with me if that's true in your mind, because I don't have a normal distribution. Can have that discussion. So there are a couple things that I'm hoping to do in MoveSci 241. I'm actually talking to people on campus about this, Genes for Good. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of it. It's housed in the School of Public Health. 23andMe, you might be familiar with. How many people know 23andMe? So most. So this is the question I asked today. Do you think that future versions of this class should provide assignments that allow, I forget what I wrote there, that link to or somehow relate back to these genetic studies? We're talking about genetic studies. And so a good majority of my students are like, wow, I wish I would have had that opportunity. So in this case, I'm strongly thinking about that. So this is basically a free version of 23andMe that's available on campus. And after I opened the door and said, hey, I'm thinking about this, they're like, we're not sure we can turn around in the time frame that you need. And then the next thing I know, they're like, we want to set up a meeting with you. So anyway, so I think there's a chance for this to happen, and I'm excited by that. I think it's related back to the kind of people learning about themselves. It's in that same flavor. So anyways, I know some people smiled when I talked about GSIs. There's a lot of room here, in my opinion. Certainly with all the grading that's here, there's lots of room for GSIs to do some work. And in fact, we could, that could be, in fact, from a tuition standpoint, a neutral effect if we just make the class bigger. It certainly could be bigger, I'm pretty confident. As long as we had a bigger classroom, then it could be a much bigger class. And the other thing that I learned is students are very interested in some of these measures that we do in physiology and exercise physiology. So for example, they're really interested, hey, could I have a measure of my basal metabolic rate? Or could I have a measure of body composition or fitness measures? So I think there would be opportunity for like an optional 1-credit lab that GSIs could teach as well. So anyways, that's just some food for thought. No pun intended. And that's all I have. The only other thing I wanted to show, and I can answer questions, because I wanted to show a little bit about gradecraft that I think is useful. So I've already shown this piece, which is kind of showing my current distribution. The other thing I wanted to show is what it looks like for a student at the beginning of the course. So this is just a sample student. And so there is something called the grade predictor. So this idea of having choice, this is something they can do on day one, is they can go in and say, okay, there are these different assignments. And so they can begin to say, what am I going to do? And how many points am I going to expect to earn in these things? And so they could conservatively begin to say like, well, I think I'm going to get most of the points on these different assignments, and I'm going to take the exam, but I might not be that great. By the way, if it's below 40%, I just say you get 0, because a multiple choice exam, at some point it's like, well, yeah, I don't get that. And people do score below 40%, so it is kind of a mind shift, because people can be like, well, I didn't study, but what's the worst thing that could happen? I'll just go take the exam. All I do is, it takes me an hour to do this, Maybe I score 50% and I get some points. So you can hate that or like it. It's kind of your choice in this case. So anyways, I'm just kind of giving you some perspective here on what the grade predictor allows one to do. So what you might notice is as I begin to sort of say, okay, I think I'm going to do this, this, and this, it's beginning to bring up this score, which shows them, here's a D minus and here's an A. And so as they accumulate these points. So the kids out in the hall, the delinquents, I'll say, out in the hall that are saying like, that guy's such a dummy, like I'm sitting at home and clicking on this. Then they're also describing like, yeah, I have to keep on going back because I'm not scoring the points that I thought I did to keep adding more points in some other thing. So these really smart guys are sort of not scoring the points they think because they don't show up to class. So anyways.
Does this interface in some way with Canvas, or do you do it wholly in here? Like you put the assignments within this software?
So Gradecraft would allow that to happen. This could be the only learning management system. In my case, I really like SpeedGrader too much. And so I have not chosen to go totally into Gradecraft. So some of the instructors that use it, they just say, Canvas, I don't need Canvas, I have Gradecraft. And so you can submit assignments, so all the sort of normal things in Canvas. I'd say Rachel would know exactly, but for me, the big piece is the lack of that whole SpeedGrader piece. That's a piece that I really like to have. And I think auto-graded like online quizzes.
Right, so we
also
don't have discussion forums, we don't have a test and quizzing tool, and we have a rubrics tool so you can do some of the SpeedGrader stuff but not all of it. And so for people who just want to use Gradecraft, they often use Piazza as their discussion tool. Qualtrics can do auto-grading of quizzes as well, and they just send out a link to their students through Gradecraft. But we also don't have a file repository, so you can attach files to assignments and all sorts of things, but you can't just go to the resources section like you could on cTools or files on Canvas. And so we have, I'd say probably most people continue to use Canvas as sort of the front page for their course. And Gradecraft can show up just in the left-hand navigation bar. We recommend you turn off your grade book so that students know that Gradecraft is where they find their grades, but you can set it up so that it shows up in an iframe, like Pete has Piazza there, or it just sends people out to the separate website.
And so she mentioned one of the piece, which in this case is Piazza is the way I try to handle all these student questions when you have this many students. And so I don't know how many of you are familiar, but that's a really nice when you have a lot of students. In engineering, it's standard issue that they use Piazza. So yeah, stuff.
So I had a couple of questions, which maybe both of you, which is, so one, given all these activities that students engage in, is it really necessary to have the lectures? I mean, they're part of it, but they're not really the central part of it, and you could think of replacing them. And the second question is there any evidence based to say that people in any measurable way learn better through this compared to the conventional?
So I'll take the second question first, which is the evidence base. So what we know is that, so we do a pre and post survey about different sort of psychological states of students. We ask them about their desire for autonomy, competence, belongingness, their perception of whether in the post survey this course supported their autonomy, belonging, competence. And we ask some questions about general motivation to engage in learning activities. We also ask questions about risk aversion and a couple other sort of psychological states that we think Gameful might support. And we see that Gameful does, in fact, for the most part, we see changes in desire or appreciation for autonomy in learning environments in these surveys, and but in terms of measurements of learning, it's harder to gauge because we know that the grade distribution shifts. That doesn't necessarily mean people are learning more. It does. We know that students have a lot more clarity about what it takes to get an A, and so that transparency factor means that students, when they make a mistake or do poorly on an assignment, they have opportunity to make up for that. And so it's hard to say from an objective standpoint that we know learning is greater. What we do know, know is perhaps an overstatement. What we hear from every single instructor who has used Gradecraft or gone Gameful is that students are much more engaged, that the instructor has enjoyed teaching the class more, and that in most courses, instructors are amazed at the larger amount of work students put into the course. And so we know that students do more of the practice opportunities that we give them, which theoretically leads to greater learning. But it's really hard. Measuring learning is one of the hardest things hardest questions anybody's asked, and none of us on the team would assert that we know students are learning more. We do know that they're doing more of the work it takes to learn.
So related to lectures, I guess the piece here would be that for some students that's going to be something they really value, and that what I'm doing there is hopefully sort of allowing them to share experience, which is certainly useful towards learning, as well as preparing them to take exams, which they are optional for them, but I hope and expect they may do. So, I don't think that there's a need to we should just throw these things out. But it certainly is not as much of a requirement as it would be in a traditional class.
We have seen instructors, and we in fact encourage this in many ways, that to think differently about the lecture space, that whether it's doing more active learning in the room or allowing that time for student presentations or something like that. But we see instructors, Robin Queen is one who, she sets a threshold. You can't get an A unless you've attended 85% of the lectures. And she tracks that. She uses active learning platform as well. I think that, or maybe it's Clickers. And so she's not trying to, collect attendance data on 300 people by sign-in sheet or anything. But the A doesn't get unlocked unless they actually attend lecture, because she believes that sense of community and the discussion that happens there is so important for learning.
There is some evidence, it's not this, but it's similar. National Science Foundation developed a K-12 next generation STEM curriculum, and they put a lot of research into that and rolled it out a few years ago, and so schools all over the place are adopting it or not, and they're generating some data, and it's kind of like this, and it's certainly a new way of teaching science that's more standards based with more choice and repeat tries until you get it.
The bottom line is that people are going to have to be able to, in the end we want to know that people can do more, and that's the thing we're worried about, that the kids don't know stuff. So it's the big question.
So what are some other that we might think of? You showed the anatomy and physiology, but that was a very different model. So something that's maybe more, extreme, you might call it, but more traditional. It's not just in my opinion, it's a really hard class.
So Poli-Sci 101 is a course that has been Gameful for, it's our longest running Gameful courses, Nicola Bach-Monti's version of that. And so the way he's implemented choice, and I would say very few people have taken Pete's path of everything is optional. Most instructors have a core engagement where students are all expected to engage in these kinds of activities or this set of activities, with then ways to either specialize or to experiment. And so for him, students can choose the traditional research paper. So they've got core engagement, which are reading quizzes and active learning platform in the classroom during lecture. But then for writing, they can choose blogging, or they can choose traditional research papers. He had actually eliminated exams, and there was nearly rioting and mutiny from the students, so we brought those back. Mostly because that's strange. Well, it's because it's what they know, and it's what they're comfortable with. And so he does have the luxury that there is not a his students aren't expected to all have mastered this certain set of political philosophers, but really that they've developed some writing skills, some reading in the discipline kinds of skills. Joanna Marecki-Milanchuk has taken, similar to MVS 241, but the Intro to Material Science course. She's made Gameful, and some aspects of it worked really well, some haven't. There's not here, but an anatomy and physiology instructor in Maryland has actually made her course very gameful, not using Graycraft, just using Canvas actually. And has, I think, more choice than Pete has put into his anatomy and physiology course. And one of the things when I talk about Gameful that I have to emphasize is it's not any one thing. It's really this philosophy that you bring into the course design. And the question about lectures tickles me because Barry Fishman, who is the principal investigator, is really innovative in a lot of ways. But if you walk into his classroom, it is a traditional lecture, sage on the stage, like not even much active learning. And so taking this approach doesn't necessarily have to change what you do in the classroom. It's really changing the assessment structure and how you're evaluating the learning rather than how you're conducting your face-to-face teaching. But for other people, this is an entryway to completely shaking up the entire way they do things.
Question going both ways. First to you. Would you see in comparison to the grades that Pete's seen, do you see typically most of them are A heavy, or do you see a normal distribution?
So we almost never see a normal distribution in letter grades. We do still see a normal distribution in points. So you'll still see that students perform, across a spectrum, but we do see a lot more A's in every single course, and most of the time we think that that's largely because of the transparency and the chance to recover from failure.
So if I guess this goes, I was going to direct this question more to people by asking as well, why not raise the points? Would you think that would just result in students just wanting to do more to get to that level, or do you think at some point you'd hit a level where you actually would get a normal distribution in your grades?
Yeah, I think the question is a good one, and I asked myself that question. And then what I came back to, and I suppose more the hippie side of me, is like, well, what is it that should be required for me? So in other words, where is it enough? So what you're describing is, well, we have to force the normal distribution. It's kind of the way you're coming at it, right? Not like, what is it that's adequate for me to call it an A? So I think that it's really hard to get a normal distribution in this kind of a setup. And trying to force it, I think you could force it. You would probably have really students like, well, you act like there's choice, but we have to do pretty much everything, right? So I think I feel the hippie part of me is like, that I can certainly bump this up, but I'm not sure that it's really what's necessary for me to feel good about the people who have it.
Yeah, I guess I'd take it more from the approach of what happens if you just did a little bit. Not like, what if you're 2100, what if you raise it just to 2400? Would you actually get a little bit more distribution out of it?
What we've seen is generally students will do what it takes to hit that mark.
Okay.
And so, which some instructors love, some instructors are like, okay, I did this so that my students wouldn't be so stressed and would really enjoy learning and make some choices, and don't want their students doing all of the assignments. And so, a quick anecdote, which some of you may have already heard, the dean of SI used to teach a very large course, Intro to Information Studies, former dean, I should say, he's since left the institution. And he taught it this way. He was not the one that designed the course, but taught it this way. He emailed the director of undergrad ed in SI and said, well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is I've never seen my students work this hard in my entire time teaching. The bad news is we can't use their grades in this course to differentiate for admissions because they're a late admit, like a delayed admit program, because almost everybody got A's. And so it really comes down to sort of your philosophy of what are grades. Are they really about mastery, or are they about differentiating between students? And there's gray area in between, but people tend to fall on one end of the spectrum. But on a course-by-course basis, I mean, Pete's a great example of, for this course, this is what I'm looking for this course, this philosophy applies.
Real quick, so it's possible for somebody to get an A without even touching the chemistry part of this. So like in other GameCraft courses, are there like categories where like you have to score a set amount of points in this category, and this category? That way you make sure the curriculum gets all covered and somebody doesn't just like escape out of like a certain area.
Yeah. So there's lots of ways to design this so that you can enforce different enforce different belief systems about what's important, different values, I should say. You know, and this will be my last little mini rant about grades, is students often can get through courses without learning a good chunk of the curriculum anyway, right? We don't know what a B means in, you know, and we just have the analytics to show that there are really a lot of ways to get a B in a course. It could be completely bombing an assignment and getting A's on everything else, or it could be just doing mediocre work all the way along. And so one of the challenges with exposing people to Gameful is they realize, wow, all this grading I've been doing has really not been telling me much anyway, which is sort of depressing or sort of liberating.
Let's thank Rachel. Thank you.